Okay. This is Radio 97. We are talking law with Despina Priala from Priala Legal. Do you have a legal question you would like answered on the radio free of charge? Despina, happy to do that for you. Go to the website radio97.com.au. You'll find the best way to contact us is through that. A couple of ways to do it. So just go to the website and send us your questions ASAP. That is radio97.com.au.
And you might have heard right before the break, we highlighted a mutual will. What is it? Is it really a will at all? Despina, I'm very intrigued. I don't know what a mutual will is. So can you shed some light on this topic for us?
I would love to. It's a very interesting topic. So in actual fact, a mutual will is not a will at all. So to properly explain that for the listeners out there, let's start with what is a will, first of all, so we can then contrast it, okay? Because the term mutual will has been used a lot out there. People might go, oh, yes, I've done a mutual will. Well, perhaps after this segment, you might then reflect, have I actually done a mutual will? And should I have done a mutual will? Or maybe I don't want to do it. So, so let's start with what is a will. So on the show, we've talked before about what is a will. And obviously, it's a document where you provide your wishes about how you want your estate distributed. So a will is a formal document, okay? And each state and territory in Australia have their own pieces of legislation that dictate the legalities of how a will is formed. So it is a formal instrument. It's a document. It is signed by the person called the testator. So just on that, I often have clients saying, what is that testator? I see it in the will. What does it mean? Well, in actual fact, the word testator means the person who makes the will, who signs the will. So you, me, we do wills. We are a testator. So the formal document signed by the testator, and there are two independent witnesses to that signing of the will, okay? And the big thing is a will might seem logical. It only operates upon death. So you've made your will, it's there, and it will only come into effect when you die, not if you die. So, but we don't know when that happens for anyone. So it operates only upon death. And of course, a will is revocable. So what does that mean? It means that if I make a will today and I want to change it, the next month or next year, I can make another will. Okay, so meaning it's revocable and I can make a new will if I want to, provided I've got capacity to make a will. Like you always have to have capacity to make a will. Now, by contrast, a mutual will doesn't have any of that. Okay, so a mutual will is actually a binding contract between two people. Okay, typically between a husband and a wife, who make corresponding wills that have the effect that neither person will revoke their will, or they won't revoke it without notice to the other person. So it's actually a binding contract, takes place or takes effect immediately. So what you're doing is you're creating an agreement between two parties. They both agree, well, here's our corresponding wills. We will not make any changes at all. We've agreed to that. It's a contract and it binds them. Okay. All right. So there are differences. And what the law says is, well, what happens then when the first person dies? Okay. So the survivor, so you got a husband and wife, husband dies first, say. The wife, okay, well, we've made these mutual wills. Well, the law says that the survivor is then under an obligation not to make any changes to the will and to give effect to the terms of that will. So it's imposed on them as a constructive trust. So that's the difference. We want to talk a little bit more to try and explain it better to the listeners. So what I want to say first is that mutual wills are not mirror wills. So there's often this misunderstanding. So husband and wife come along and, okay, we want to make wills that are similar or the same in terms. So unless there's that binding agreement between them, they're just mirror wills. They're not mutual wills. So mirror wills can be changed. They can be changed later on. So there are differences.
One person can change it at a different time. They don't
have to
do it together.
That's right. And typically husband and wife say, yes, we want to do the same. And there's a level of trust that, oh, no, I'm not going to make any changes. We want to stick to this. But in reality, if they want to make a change down the track, they can. Okay, so it's still revocable. So you might sort of say, why would people consider making mutual wills? So perhaps they'll give you a better understanding what it is. So look, one good example is you've got a couple that are retirees. They've established a lot of wealth together over the years, over the course of their time. and they want to protect it against the potential for repartnership. Okay, so you can imagine that scenario: husband and wife, they've been together for say 50 years, accumulated a lot of wealth together, and then they make these mutual wills. So if whoever dies first, they want to make sure that, well, if that person who's left might remarry, I want to make sure the wealth's preserved so it goes down to their children, for example.
Doesn't that make sense?
So giving examples might explain it a bit better. Yes. Yeah. So blended families is another great example of why people might want to consider mutual wills. So blended families, each person's been married before. They typically have children from prior marriages, and they come together for their second or third marriage. Okay. So then you've got these competing interests between the spouse, the new marriage, versus adult children. Typically we see in the prior marriage. Okay.
More fingers in the pie.
So that's really then in that case to protect the entitlement of children of previous marriages whilst trying to provide for your new spouse. So that's another situation where you might want to consider it. You've got intergenerational wealth is another great example. So you've got two parties coming together. Each person really hasn't created any real wealth in their own right, but you've got one party that's going to inherit quite a lot of wealth from their family, and you want that preserved for lineal descendants. So people within the person's own family, not the partner's family. And that's another great example of where you might consider mutual wills. And there's a very notable case called Birmingham and Renfrew, all the way from 1937, that talked about this very thing about intergenerational wealth and mutual wills.
Now, is there a reason why you would choose one over the other? So the question is one better than the other?
Yeah.
Would you steer people in one direction?
I would not do that as a matter of course to say you should do mutual wills over mirror wills or vice versa, because each person's circumstances is different. They must be assessed properly, and you should never go into mutual wills without getting proper advice up front to understand what this actually means, as opposed to just doing a mirror will, because it's a binding contract, right? So there's perils and pitfalls sometimes with doing mutual wills, and you need to understand, and that might be different from person to person. So you need to really get that advice up front. So if you want to talk about, well, what are the pros and cons? I mean, what are the advantages, disadvantages anyway? So look, what are the advantages? There's a transparency. So you and your partner go into this, there's an open understanding. We definitely agree to this. These are the reasons why we're going to do this binding agreement between ourselves that we're going to preserve the assets in this way. So there's transparency. It's a good way to strike a balance between the competing interests, say if adult children from a prior marriage to your new spouse. It's a good way to balance that interest out. And it's security. There's a contract in place, okay? Versus, of course, law's never black and white. So you've got the disadvantages, okay? And you've got, look, it could be seen as a bit rigid and inflexible, because you've set it up, you can't really revoke it. Okay, so then you go, oh, okay, it's set in stone, and you really would perhaps not suggest it for couples early in the marriage, right? Because they've only just got married. So depending on the situation.
Well, yeah, I was just quickly about to ask, what if someone cheats, or if there's a divorce in the works, or...
Really good question. So
it
can happen. And that's where you come down to, is it really enforceable? So, and there's lots of case law on this. It's a bucket load of case law about whether a mutual will can be enforced, and it can be, but it depends on a lot of things. And that's why you need to get that advice. And by doing a mutual will, I mean, a disadvantage is you're really removing, in some cases, your possible future legal rights, because you don't know what the future is going to hold, do you? And if you didn't get the advice up front, maybe you haven't considered the uncertainty. Maybe you've got joint assets. You haven't considered claims that might be made against your estate down the track. So there's lots of things to consider here. There are pros and cons with mutual wills. So you don't just go into it lightly. You need to talk about it. You need to get that advice. Should I do it? Should I not? Every person's situation is different. But I wanted to mention it today because people might out there think, well, I've done a mutual will and I've bound my spouse, my partner to this. Well, have you? And have you done it, and why? And should you do it? So all these are all issues to think about, and it's very different to doing a mirror will. Very different.
There you go. Well, if anyone does want advice on a mutual will or anything else to do with the law and they want to get in contact with you, Despina, where can they go?
So they can phone the office during office hours. Of course, we'd like to hear from our listeners, 55291 They can email info@prialalegal.com.au. And then, of course, this segment, the whole segment will be uploaded on YouTube later on if anyone's missed segments of it today.
Yeah, just search Priala Legal, Priala. Thank you so much again, Despina and Wayne.
We'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys. See you then.